You didn't lose access, you lost relevance, and this video is about how that happens quietly. What would you do if a single sentence was enough to make everyone in the room look at you like they'd never really known you at all? How fast do you think trust collapses when fear walks in, wearing confidence instead of facts? And here's the question most adults don't ask themselves until it's already too late. If your partner ever decided to save themselves by sacrificing your name, would anyone actually stop to hear your side? I used to believe reputation worked like a savings account, that if you showed up, worked hard, stayed loyal, you earned a kind of protection when things went wrong. That belief didn't just crack. It shattered on Christmas Eve, in my parents' living room, with the smell of holiday food still in the air and people smiling like nothing bad could ever touch us. One moment I was standing there thinking about nothing more serious than getting through the evening. The next, my wife said something out loud, a sentence I wasn't prepared for, an accusation I didn't even recognize yet, and the room went completely still. No music, no chatter, just that thick silence where you can almost hear people recalculating who they think you are. I remember the scrape of a chair, a sharp inhale from somewhere behind me, and the sudden drop in my chest when it hit me that I wasn't just being accused, I was being judged in real time. That's the part nobody warns you about when you grow up. As an adult, you don't just risk losing a relationship, you risk losing your identity in a single moment if the wrong narrative takes hold. I felt it immediately. The way familiar faces shifted, how concern turned into suspicion before I could even process what was happening. I wanted to speak, to clarify, to slow everything down, but my mind lagged behind the moment, frozen between disbelief and reality. And once that shift happens, logic doesn't matter yet, facts don't matter yet. All that matters is who appears more convincing in their pain and who's standing there stunned, trying to catch up. If you've ever worried that shock could be mistaken for guilt, or that staying silent for even a few seconds might be used against you, you already understand why that night still weighs on me. Because what was unfolding in that room wasn't just a private marital issue. It was a public collapse, happening faster than I could stop it. I walked into that house thinking Christmas meant familiarity, safety, maybe a little harmless chaos. I had no idea I was about to watch my life split cleanly into before and after. And the part that still stays with me isn't even the accusation itself. It's what happened immediately after, when the people I trusted reacted in a way I never thought possible. Before that night, my parents' house was the one place I never questioned. It wasn't perfect, but it was familiar in the way adults rely on when everything else feels unstable. That living room had absorbed years of noise, arguments, celebrations, uncomfortable conversations, and somehow always returned to normal. My dad was the kind of person who believed slowing things down solved most problems, that facts mattered more than volume. My mom trusted her instincts, her emotions, always quick to protect when someone seemed hurt. My siblings filled their usual roles, loud in different ways, keeping the atmosphere predictable just by being themselves. From the outside, we looked solid, boring even, the kind of family people assumed would handle tension without imploding. I believed that too, right up until my wife finished speaking. I felt the shift almost immediately. I saw it in their eyes first, the way they moved from her to me, not with curiosity, but with calculation, like they were already trying to make sense of something before I'd even caught up to it myself. That was the moment the room stopped feeling neutral. No one spoke yet, but the air changed, heavy and alert, like everyone was bracing for the same thing without saying it out loud. Standing there, I realized how fragile familiarity actually is. Knowing someone for years doesn't guarantee fairness. It just makes people more confident in the conclusions they reach when emotions lead the way. I could sense the questions forming without words, stacking silently in the space between us. How could this come out now? What does this say about him? How did we miss it? I wanted to pull them back into context, into history, into the version of me they'd known long before this moment. But the room didn't wait. The process had already started, and I was behind it. I was still standing in the same spot, surrounded by people I trusted, watching the ground shift under assumptions I thought were solid. That house, that sense of safety I'd carried into the night, was already changing shape. And just as I was realizing the room had already chosen a direction, someone finally broke the silence. And the moment they did, everything shifted for good. "It's true, isn't it?" My sister's voice cut through the room, sharp and sudden, and every head turned toward her. She wasn't yelling, not yet, but there was something firm in the way she said it, like the question already knew its own answer. She was looking straight at me, arms crossed, jaw tight, waiting. The room felt smaller instantly, like the walls had moved in a few inches when she spoke. I opened my mouth to respond, but my dad raised a hand slightly, not at her, at me. "Let him answer," he said, calm but serious, the kind of tone that usually meant things were about to get sorted out. Except this time, it didn't feel like protection. It felt like procedure. My wife was still crying softly, my mom beside her now, rubbing her back in slow, automatic motions. No one was looking at me anymore. Not really. They were looking at the situation, at the version of events forming between them. I finally spoke, my voice sounding unfamiliar even to me, thinner than I expected. "I don't even know what you think I did," I said. The words landed badly. My sister let out a short breath through her nose like she'd just heard something disappointing. "That's not an answer," she replied. That's when I realized the rules had already changed. This wasn't about understanding anymore. It was about response time, tone, whether I sounded convincing enough under pressure. My dad shifted in his seat, leaning forward now, elbows on his knees. "We're just trying to understand how this could happen," he said, carefully choosing each word. Understand, not if it happened, how. The assumption slid into place so smoothly it almost went unnoticed. I felt my chest tighten as I looked around the room, searching for someone, anyone, who looked uncertain, who looked like they might slow this down. Instead, I saw nods, small ones, almost unconscious, as if the group was syncing up without realizing it. My wife finally looked up then, eyes red, voice quiet but steady. "I didn't want to say anything," she said, staring at the floor, "but I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine." That sentence sealed something. It reframed the entire night, cast her as the reluctant truth teller and me as the reason silence had become unbearable. My mom squeezed her shoulder a little tighter, and my dad exhaled slowly, the way he did when he thought a difficult conversation was unavoidable. No one asked me to sit down. No one asked if I needed a moment. I was still standing, still trying to keep up as the conversation continued around me like I was already a problem to be managed instead of a person to be heard. And before I could even finish processing that realization, someone else spoke, and what they said pushed this past anything I could walk back from. "You need to step outside for a minute." My dad said it calmly, almost gently, but it wasn't a suggestion. He was already standing when the words left his mouth, gesturing toward the hallway like this was the most reasonable thing in the world. The room didn't react with surprise. No one objected. My mom didn't look up from my wife. My sister avoided my eyes entirely. That's how I knew this wasn't about cooling off. It was about removal. I hesitated, just for a second, waiting for someone to clarify, to say this was temporary, to explain what a minute actually meant. No one did, so I walked. Each step felt heavier than it should have, like the house itself was resisting me leaving the room. The hallway light buzzed softly, the door closing behind me with a muted click that landed harder than a slam ever could. I stood there alone, staring at a framed family photo on the wall, trying to understand how quickly I'd gone from being part of the conversation to being excluded from it entirely. Voices muffled through the door, indistinct but active, rising and falling without me. I couldn't hear words, but I didn't need to. The rhythm told me enough. Discussion, agreement, momentum. I leaned against the wall, arms crossed, waiting to be called back in, convinced this was procedural, that once things settled, I'd be brought back to explain myself. Minutes passed, then more. No one came. Eventually, my dad stepped into the hallway alone, closing the door behind him. He didn't sit. He didn't ask how I was holding up. He just said, "We think it's best if you give her some space tonight." Space. The word landed carefully like it had been rehearsed. I asked what that meant, even though I already knew. He avoided the question by answering around it. "She's not in a state to talk right now," he said. "And things are complicated." Complicated. Another soft word doing hard work. I realized then that a decision had already been made while I was standing in the hallway, listening to my own family move forward without me. I asked if I could at least say something, explain my side. He shook his head slightly. "Now isn't the time," he said. "Not yet. Maybe later." Phrases designed to sound temporary while closing doors completely. He told me I should probably leave for the night, that staying would only make things worse. I looked past him at the closed door, at the room where my wife and my family were together, and understood what was really happening. I wasn't being asked to leave because I was dangerous or loud or disruptive. I was being removed because my presence complicated the narrative they'd already started to accept. I grabbed my coat from the chair by the entrance, no one stopping me, no one following. The front door opened easily, the cold air rushing in like punctuation at the end of a sentence I hadn't been allowed to finish. And standing there in the cold, I understood this wasn't a pause or a misunderstanding. It was the first step in being pushed completely out, and the next move wouldn't be mine. I hadn't even reached the end of the driveway when my phone buzzed. I almost ignored it, still trying to steady my breathing in the cold, but something in my chest tightened before I even looked. It was a message from my brother. Just one line. "She's staying here tonight. Dad thinks it's best if you don't come back until things settle." No question mark, no discussion, just a statement. Like a policy update I was expected to accept. I reread it twice, like the meaning might change if I gave it enough time. It didn't. That was the moment it stopped being about one night. Whatever decision had been made was already moving without me. I got into my car, hands unsteady as I started the engine, and before I pulled away, another notification came through. This time, it was my mom. "We just want everyone to calm down. Please don't make this harder." Harder, as if I was already complicating something I hadn't been allowed to participate in. I drove away with the house still lit behind me, knowing conversations were continuing in that living room while I was physically removed from them. Halfway down the road, my wife's location disappeared from our shared app. I noticed it instantly, the way you notice silence when a constant sound stops. That's when the permanence began to settle in. This wasn't just space, it was separation being formalized, quietly, step by step. By the time I got home, my phone was still again, but the escalation hadn't stopped. I checked my email out of habit and saw a message from my sister-in-law sent less than 10 minutes earlier. It was polite, too polite. "Hey, just wanted to say we're thinking of you both. Hope everyone gets the support they need." Both. The word sat there longer than it should have. It was the kind of message people send after they've already been told who to feel sorry for. The story had already moved beyond the room. People who hadn't been there now knew something had happened, and whatever version they'd been given didn't include my voice. I sat on the edge of the bed, coat still on, phone in my hand, realizing how fast access disappears once you're no longer present to shape perception. No one asked me to clarify anything. No one checked in to hear what I remembered about the night. Boundaries were being drawn efficiently, without conflict or explanation. Don't come back yet. Give her space. Let things settle. Each phrase closed another door. I typed out 3 different messages to my wife and deleted all of them. Anything I said now would pass through decisions already made for me. Silence, I realized, wasn't neutral anymore. It was being interpreted. And somewhere between the driveway and my empty bedroom, it became clear this wasn't just conflict spreading, it was momentum. And the next consequence wouldn't require my presence at all. I woke up the next morning to an empty phone. No missed calls, no messages sent overnight that I hadn't seen. Just silence. The kind that feels intentional once you've learned how quickly people can reach you when they want to. For a few seconds, lying there staring at the ceiling, I let myself believe that meant nothing new had happened. That maybe everything was paused, waiting. Then I sat up and checked again. Slower this time, like I was bracing for impact. Still nothing. What changed wasn't the silence itself. It was how normal it already felt. I got dressed without urgency, moved through the apartment on autopilot, and only realized something was wrong when I reached for my phone to check her location and remembered it was gone. That absence had settled in overnight, quiet and final. Later that morning, I noticed I'd been removed from the shared calendar we'd used for years. No alert, no explanation. Appointments and plans that had included my name the day before now existed without it. It was small. It was precise. Around noon, I got a message. Not from my wife, not from my parents, but from a number I didn't recognize at first. It was her friend. Short, polite. "Hey, just wanted to check in and see if you're okay. Please respect that she needs space right now." There it was again. Space. A boundary I hadn't agreed to being enforced anyway. I didn't reply, not because I had nothing to say, but because I understood the rule being introduced. Communication no longer moved freely. It passed through other people now. A few hours later, my dad emailed me. Not texted, emailed. Subject line: next steps. I stared at it longer than I should have. That's when it became impossible to pretend this was temporary. The message was measured, almost procedural, outlining expectations. No unannounced visits, limited contact, time for emotions to settle. He ended it by saying everyone just wanted what was best. It read like closure dressed up as concern. That night, I went to the grocery store and ran into someone I knew. They asked how my wife was doing, not how we were doing, how she was. The question was gentle, but it landed hard. I answered carefully and realized halfway through that I was already responding to a version of events I hadn't participated in shaping. By the time I got home, it was clear this wasn't a cooling off period anymore. The boundaries weren't waiting to be discussed, they were already operating. My absence was being organized around. Decisions were being documented. Concern was being distributed. And that's when it hit me. Whatever this had turned into no longer required my input. The next consequence wouldn't involve a conversation at all. I found out I'd been spoken for by accident. A mutual friend texted me late that afternoon, casual in tone, like they were picking up a conversation we'd already had. "Hey, I heard you're giving her space for a while. That must be really hard." I stared at the message, trying to place where that phrasing came from. Giving her space. Not being told to leave. Not being asked to stay away. Just a clean, voluntary decision attributed to me. I asked where they'd heard that. The reply came a few minutes later. "Your sister mentioned it. She said you agreed it was best." I didn't correct them. I felt how that would land now. How any objection would sound like backpedaling instead of truth. Silence had already been translated. Later that day, I was added to a group email I hadn't been part of before. It included my parents, my wife, and two people I barely knew. The subject line was neutral, logistical. Moving forward. The message outlined expectations again, framed as mutual understanding. As discussed, it said, referring to a conversation I hadn't been in. Replies stacked beneath it. Agreement, appreciation, relief. I wasn't asked to weigh in. My role was implied, not invited. That evening, my wife posted a photo online. Nothing dramatic, just her on a couch with a blanket, a caption about focusing on healing. The comments filled quickly. Support, sympathy, encouragement. I wasn't mentioned. I existed only as context. A reason, not a voice. The next morning, my dad forwarded me a message from a family friend. "We're all hoping he takes this time to reflect." Reflect. The word was gentle, almost generous, but it carried a conclusion with it. Distance had become my choice. Growth had become my responsibility. Whatever had happened was now something I was expected to process quietly. By noon, I realized no one had asked me a direct question in over a day. No one wanted clarification. Everything that mattered had already been settled somewhere else. I considered pushing back, insisting on my own words, but I could see the shape of it clearly now. Speaking wouldn't restore balance. It would disrupt the calm that had formed without me. That's when it became undeniable. I had been repositioned from narrator to subject, from person to premise. And somewhere in that shift, consequences had started forming that didn't need my voice at all, only my absence. The first call didn't feel like confrontation, which was what made it unsettling. It came from my manager, with HR quietly included, framed as a routine check-in. The kind of call that pretends to exist for support while already rearranging things in the background. From the start, it was clear this wasn't about hearing from me. It was about documenting that the conversation had happened. No questions were asked, no curiosity shown. Just careful language about coverage, continuity, and making sure everything stayed stable while things settled. A word that suggested movement without admitting what had caused it. Nothing specific was mentioned. No accusation, no reference to the night that started all of this. The conversation circled the same phrases again and again. Temporary adjustments, shared responsibility, minimizing exposure, access would be adjusted, responsibilities would be redistributed. Communication would be streamlined. Each sentence moved something forward without naming who was deciding or why. By the time the call ended, I realized I hadn't been asked a single thing about my perspective. I was thanked for my understanding instead, as if agreement had already been assumed. When I hung up, there was no immediate fallout, no dramatic shift, just the quiet awareness that a record now existed somewhere, one that didn't need anything further from me to stay active. Later that day, a coworker messaged asking if I was still included on a shared thread because my name hadn't appeared on the latest update. I stared at the message longer than I should have before replying. Then I typed that it was probably a system issue. I deleted that sentence once, rewrote it, sent it anyway. Over the next few days, the changes stayed subtle. Fewer direct messages, conversations pausing when I entered a room, people choosing words more carefully than before. Not cold, not hostile, just managed. Like everyone had been given quiet instructions they didn't need explained. What stood out wasn't exclusion, but accommodation. Access wasn't revoked outright. It was softened, narrowed, rerouted, as if the goal wasn't to remove me, but to make sure I couldn't interfere with whatever was stabilizing around the situation. No one told me this was happening. No one needed to. By the time I noticed how thoroughly behavior had adjusted around me, it was clear this wasn't a misunderstanding waiting to be resolved. It had already settled into place, and whatever moved next wouldn't arrive as a conversation at all. It would arrive carried out, already normalized by the time I noticed what had been taken. The notice didn't arrive dramatically. It showed up the way procedures always do, quietly, impersonally, already formatted. It landed in my inbox mid-morning with a subject line that sounded neutral enough to ignore if you didn't know better. Something like next steps, capitalized carefully, as if that alone made it cooperative. The message didn't ask how I was doing. It didn't reference anything specific. It outlined a process. Effective immediately, certain access would be limited while a review took place. Not because of an incident, not because of an outcome, but as a precaution. That word carried more weight than anything else on the page. Precaution meant the action came before the conclusion. The email explained what would happen next in bullet points, who would handle what, which systems would be temporarily unavailable to me, how communication would be routed to reduce confusion. There was a sentence about cooperation, another about professionalism, and a closing line that thanked me in advance for my understanding. I read it once, then again, slower this time, noticing how little space there was for response. Not because replies were forbidden, but because nothing in the message required one. I opened a blank reply anyway, just to see what it felt like. My cursor blinked on the screen longer than I expected. I typed a sentence, stopped, deleted it, rewrote it, then erased everything again. There was no place to begin that wouldn't sound defensive, and no tone that wouldn't be read through a frame I didn't control. So I closed the draft. Then I deleted it. Over the next few hours, the changes rolled out exactly as described. Access errors appeared where there hadn't been any before. Notifications stopped coming. A system I logged into daily no longer recognized my credentials. No one reached out to explain it, because explanation wasn't part of what was happening. By the end of the day, it was clear the process didn't need anyone to believe anything about me to keep moving. It only needed to exist. Once it did, it carried itself forward. Meetings continued without me. Tasks were reassigned cleanly. The structure absorbed the adjustment without friction, like it had been designed to do exactly this. What struck me wasn't the restriction itself, but how quickly my position inside the system changed without discussion. I wasn't being removed, I was being reclassified. And once that happens, the next step doesn't ask questions or wait for context, it reaches straight for what defines you next. The next consequence didn't arrive as an announcement, it surfaced as a delay. The kind you don't question at first because delays happen all the time, until you realize this one has no explanation attached to it. A form I'd submitted weeks earlier sat untouched in the system, status unchanged, timestamp frozen as if time had stopped specifically around my name. I checked it once, then again the next day, then the day after that, each time expecting movement and finding none, while similar requests around it advanced normally. When I finally reached out, not to challenge anything, just to ask if additional information was needed, the response came back polite and brief, thanking me for my patience and assuring me it was under review, a phrase that sounded active while committing to nothing. Nothing in the reply acknowledged the delay itself. It treated waiting as expected. That's when I started noticing how often patience was being asked of me lately, always framed as cooperation, never as a choice. Other small things followed, subtle enough that I questioned whether I was imagining patterns where none existed. A credential renewal took longer than usual. A routine approval required an extra step. An automated reminder referenced expectations I hadn't been informed of. Each instance, on its own, was explainable. Together, they formed a new rhythm, slower, heavier, less forgiving. I stopped being someone the system anticipated and became someone it paused around. What unsettled me most was how little resistance there was to this shift. No one objected, no one flagged it as unusual. Colleagues adjusted without comment, rerouting questions elsewhere, CCing different names, filling gaps I hadn't realized were now assumed. I wasn't excluded outright, I was deprioritized. And deprioritization doesn't announce itself as punishment, it masquerades as logistics. I tried once more to clarify, choosing my words carefully, keeping the tone neutral, asking only whether timelines had changed. The reply thanked me again for my understanding and explained that certain processes could take longer given current considerations. Those considerations were never named, but they didn't need to be. They were already doing their work. I felt the shift most clearly in how my own behavior began to change in response. I hesitated before sending messages. I reread emails twice before hitting send. I stopped volunteering for things that might require approval later, not because anyone told me to, but because the cost of friction had quietly increased. That's how aftermath works. It teaches you new limits without ever stating them. By the time I recognized how much ground had been lost, it wasn't dramatic or obvious. It was cumulative, small delays stacking into distance, silence turning into absence. And somewhere inside that process, a version of me was being defined by default, not by action, but by what I was no longer positioned to do. I understood then that this wasn't about resolving what had happened. It was about living inside what it had become, and the next consequence wouldn't arrive as a decision. It would arrive as something I was no longer eligible for, already gone by the time I realized it had ever been mine. The first indication didn't come as a warning or a conversation. It arrived as a routine system notice, brief enough that I nearly dismissed it, informing me that my request couldn't be processed because I no longer met the necessary criteria. The wording was clean and standardized, the kind meant to slide past without friction. I reread it anyway, then opened the attached explanation, expecting a sentence that clarified what had changed, but there wasn't one. Only a familiar list of requirements I'd met for years. That absence made the denial feel less like a decision and more like a quiet adjustment I'd somehow missed. I checked my records next, scrolling through approvals and confirmations that were still there, unchanged, which only deepened the sense that the rules hadn't been broken so much as moved. I drafted a short message asking for clarification, then paused before sending it. It was late, the room dim, the screen reflecting back a version of myself already hesitating. When I finally submitted the inquiry, the form redirected it to a general inbox promising responses as capacity allows, language that sounded cooperative while removing any urgency. The reply came the following day, polite, distant. It explained that eligibility was assessed automatically based on current information and that no further action was required at this time. No accusation, no reference point, no appeal mentioned, just reassurance that the process was functioning as designed, which was the moment I realized this wasn't about communication at all. After that, the smaller signals began to align. A portal I'd once accessed without thinking now asked for credentials I didn't have. A form autofilled my name but left the submit button inactive, forcing me to sit there longer than necessary, noticing the finality in something so minor. A reminder arrived for an obligation I was no longer authorized to complete, addressed to me yet already rerouted elsewhere. I reread that one twice, like the meaning might shift if I looked at it long enough. From there, the adjustment turned inward. I stopped assuming access, stopped clicking automatically, started rereading instructions I'd once skimmed, feeling my expectations recalibrate to limits that had never been stated outright. What unsettled me wasn't any single restriction, but how smoothly each interaction presented itself as reasonable, orderly, and neutral, as if nothing unusual was happening. Spread over days, it became clear this wasn't a temporary delay or a misunderstanding waiting to be resolved. Something about how I was categorized had changed, and it no longer required explanation to hold. I hadn't been told I was excluded. I was still present, still named, but I was no longer recognized in the same way. And the thought that lingered wasn't about what I'd already lost, but where this change would surface next, because whatever followed wouldn't arrive as a conversation or a clarification request. It would appear quietly in a place that governed credibility or standing, something I would only notice when it mattered and I was already no longer allowed to reach for it. The first time I realized the reclassification had fully escaped the systems and entered real life, it didn't arrive as confrontation or explanation. It showed up as a small change in how someone interacted with me, easy to miss if you weren't already paying attention. We were talking about something ordinary, standing in a place that had always felt neutral, when the conversation hesitated just long enough to register before redirecting itself. A task I'd handled countless times was reassigned mid-sentence, framed as a practical adjustment, explained as being easier if it went another direction for now. No one looked at me when it happened. The tone stayed calm, even courteous, but something tightened in my chest anyway. A brief flare of confusion followed by the uncomfortable awareness that I was the only one reacting. Later that week, another moment sealed it. A small gathering had happened. Nothing important, nothing urgent, and I learned about it afterward, mentioned casually as if my absence were already built into the story. There was no apology, no hesitation, no sense that anything unusual had occurred. That was when I understood this wasn't about exclusion in response to something I'd done, it was about navigation around something I'd become. Somewhere along the way, a version of me had taken shape without my involvement, and people were responding to it instinctively. I noticed it in the way conversations shortened when I joined, in how decisions reached me already resolved, not defended, just delivered. Standing alone in my kitchen later that night, phone buzzing on the counter, I felt a sharp, sudden surge of anger, quick, contained, but unmistakable, not directed at anyone in particular, but at how quietly the ground had shifted while I was still standing on it. After that, I caught myself adapting in ways I didn't consciously choose. I paused before offering context. I softened statements before they left my mouth. I let assumptions pass that I would have corrected before, not because I agreed, but because I could sense how easily explanation would now register as disruption rather than contribution. Trust hadn't vanished. It had thinned, recalibrated into something provisional. And the most disorienting part was how efficiently this framing spread. It didn't rely on argument or belief, just repetition. Each interaction reinforced it slightly until it felt less like something being done to me and more like something being maintained around me. I wasn't being challenged, corrected, or pushed out. I was being repositioned quietly, and people were adjusting accordingly. By the time I recognized how consistently this reflected version of me was shaping outcomes, who deferred, who double-checked, who no longer looped me in on matters that once assumed my involvement, I understood the next consequence wouldn't announce itself as conflict or conversation. It would surface somewhere formal and lasting, likely tied to work, responsibility, or professional trust, confirming that this shift had already moved beyond perception and into something that could follow me long after the interactions themselves faded. At some point, the shift stopped announcing itself through new developments and started showing up as expectation. I noticed it the first time I opened a message thread, already assuming I wouldn't be needed. That assumption landed with a brief, sharp discomfort, quick enough to miss if I hadn't paused, but it stayed with me. Meetings continued, but my relationship to them changed. I didn't wait for invitations anymore. I skimmed summaries after the fact, registering decisions that felt complete without ever feeling contested. What surprised me wasn't being left out, but how little resistance my absence seemed to generate. The system didn't wobble, it didn't slow, it simply adjusted its flow. Later, when I tried to complete a task I'd once handled routinely, I discovered the option was gone. Not hidden, not denied, just unavailable. The interface didn't acknowledge the change. It behaved as if this had always been the case. I felt a brief spike of irritation then, sharper than anything earlier, followed almost immediately by something quieter and heavier, the understanding that pushing back would mark me as out of sync rather than overlooked. I drafted a question anyway. It was measured, neutral, framed to minimize disruption. Reading it back, I recognized how carefully it bent around an unspoken rule. I deleted it without hesitation. That moment mattered more than I expected. It wasn't resignation, it was calibration. From then on, I began noticing how often I adjusted before being asked, how quickly I stepped aside, how naturally I avoided occupying space that no longer seemed designed for me. Information still reached me, but thinner now, stripped of context. Updates arrived already resolved, framed as continuity rather than choice. Nothing confrontational, nothing personal, just motion that no longer required my alignment to proceed. Over time, the distinction between visibility and relevance clarified. I was still visible. My name still appeared. My history remained intact. What had changed was standing, the quiet authority to influence outcomes before they settled. Once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. Absence wasn't being imposed, it was being assumed. The system had learned how to function as if I were optional, then as if I were background, and finally as if I were already elsewhere. That progression didn't feel punitive, it felt orderly. What unsettled me was how quickly that order stabilized. There was no moment to appeal to because there had been no moment of disruption. By the time I understood what had shifted, the configuration was already in place, reinforced by routine and protected by calm language. Whatever followed wouldn't arrive as a confrontation or a correction. It would arrive as something already reassigned, something that depended on my continued absence to remain seamless, making my return not just unnecessary, but incompatible with what had quietly replaced me. The next change didn't arrive through policy or access, it showed up in how people positioned themselves around decisions that used to include me. At first, it was subtle enough to dismiss. A colleague glanced past me before answering a question I'd asked directly, checking alignment elsewhere before responding. In a meeting, a familiar issue came up and someone summarized it for me, efficiently, politely, as if I were being brought up to speed rather than consulted. The summary wasn't wrong. That was the part that landed hardest. There was a brief, unmistakable flush of embarrassment, not dramatic, not public, just enough to register. It wasn't about being corrected or ignored. It was the realization that my presence had shifted from necessary to optional, and that no one felt the need to acknowledge the change. That moment lingered longer than I expected, and once I noticed it, the pattern widened. Decisions I'd been tracking arrived already resolved, announced with calm finality. Explanations were shorter now, framed as updates rather than discussions. No one contradicted me outright. They simply moved faster than I could enter the conversation. What made it difficult to push back was how reasonable everything sounded. Timelines had tightened, alignment had already happened, priorities had shifted. Each justification carried the tone of efficiency, not exclusion. Challenging it would have meant reopening conversations everyone else seemed finished with. Somewhere in that stretch, my own behavior began to change. At first, it felt like professionalism. I waited for cleaner moments to speak. I softened suggestions. I framed ideas as flexible, provisional, easy to set aside. It felt adaptive, even generous. But over time, that posture hardened into something else. I wasn't shaping outcomes anymore. I was managing impressions. That distinction settled slowly, then all at once. I could still contribute information, but it landed after direction had already been chosen. My input was acknowledged, noted, and absorbed without altering momentum. The process didn't resist me, it simply didn't require me. One afternoon, I realized a decision had been made using assumptions about my position that I hadn't actually stated. No one had misrepresented me. They'd inferred what was most convenient and proceeded. I hovered over a response longer than I should have, reread it twice, then closed the draft. Correcting the assumption would have required reasserting relevance I could no longer clearly claim. Letting it stand felt easier, and that recognition carried its own quiet cost. By then, the structure around me had settled. I was still present, still informed, still treated with surface respect. but influence had detached from visibility, and authority no longer depended on my participation to hold. What unsettled me wasn't that things continued without me. It was that they now moved more smoothly that way, and the next consequence wouldn't touch access or procedure at all, but something closer to standing, responsibility, and the opportunities that quietly stop arriving once you're no longer part of how decisions are made. The first opportunity didn't disappear all at once. It arrived already completed somewhere else. I learned about it indirectly, through a casual reference that assumed my absence had been intentional. Someone mentioned timelines and scope, spoke as if the decision had unfolded naturally, without resistance. I remember nodding before I fully understood what I was agreeing with. When I asked a clarifying question, there was a pause, brief, practiced, followed by an explanation that sounded reasonable enough. It had already been assigned, based on availability and continuity. No one framed it as a choice against me. Still, something in my chest tightened, sharper than the quiet unease I'd grown used to. For a moment, embarrassment surfaced. Not loud, just clean and unmistakable. I replayed recent weeks, searching for the point where I might have stepped back voluntarily. I couldn't find one. That was when the realization settled. The option hadn't been removed, it had simply stopped appearing. After that, the pattern became easier to recognize. Invitations shifted subtly from collaborative to informational. I was looped in after outcomes were settled, not while they were still forming. Tasks arrived scoped and finalized, framed as execution rather than direction. The language around me stayed polite, even accommodating, which made the shift harder to name. But the redistribution of trust was unmistakable. It wasn't withdrawn, it was rerouted. The cost of adapting showed up sooner than I expected. I began hesitating before offering ideas that might slow momentum. I shortened messages, trimmed context, removed anything that might require explanation. I noticed how smoothly things moved when I stayed within those bounds, and how easily they moved without me when I didn't. One moment made the change feel permanent. I was asked to provide background for a project I would once have led. I stared at the draft longer than necessary, aware that whatever I sent would move forward without me attached to it. I chose neutrality over insight, efficiency over perspective. When the final plan circulated, my contribution was there, integrated, unattributed, already resolved. That was the moment the pattern hardened. I stopped assuming opportunity and started waiting for permission. I measured relevance by response time. I learned which inputs were absorbed and which quietly stalled progress, and I adjusted accordingly. It felt practical, responsible, but beneath that adaptation was a growing certainty that reversal was no longer simple. These weren't temporary workarounds, they were habits forming around my absence. Opportunities weren't being denied, they were being allocated elsewhere by default. Trust wasn't questioned, it was no longer presumed. I remained capable, informed, useful. What I was no longer was central. And the most unsettling part was how little friction this required. No confrontation, no announcement, just a sequence of reasonable choices that closed a window I hadn't realized was narrowing. I understood then that credibility doesn't disappear when it's challenged. It erodes when it's bypassed long enough to stop being expected. And once that happens, the system doesn't need to remove you at all. It simply continues, already shaping who is consulted, who is assigned, and whose absence will soon be noticed only when something goes wrong. By the time I realized nothing more was being actively taken, the loss had already settled into something quieter. Not conflict, not exclusion. Residue, the after effects of decisions that no longer needed reinforcement. I still showed up. I still responded. My name still appeared in places that suggested continuity. But the role those appearances played had changed. I wasn't shaping direction anymore. I was stabilizing outcomes that had already been set. The difference was subtle enough that it took time to register. No one corrected me when I spoke. No one challenged my presence, but the room no longer adjusted around my input. Conversations didn't pause. Momentum didn't wait. I remember one meeting in particular, sitting with my notebook open, pen resting against the page, and realizing halfway through that I hadn't written anything down. Not because there was nothing to note, but because nothing required my anticipation. That was new. I could feel when my contributions landed as optional rather than necessary, acknowledged without altering trajectory. At first, I told myself this was normal, a phase, a transition, something temporary, but patterns teach faster than explanations. Over time, I noticed how easily things proceeded when I said nothing at all. Decisions resolved themselves elsewhere. Updates arrived prepackaged, framed as conclusions instead of questions. I was included in the aftermath, not the formation. The most disorienting part wasn't being sidelined, it was how cleanly the system absorbed that change. Nothing broke, nothing slowed. The absence of friction made it harder to argue that anything had gone wrong. I began to understand that what had been lost wasn't access or opportunity, but influence, the quiet, unspoken ability to shape what happened next. And once influence disappears, reclaiming it isn't a matter of effort, it's a matter of permission, granted by structures that no longer register your need for it. What remained was a reduced outline, competent, reliable, unobtrusive, someone trusted to execute but no longer asked to imagine, someone copied on outcomes but not invited into uncertainty. I could be depended on to carry things forward, just not to decide where forward was. I adjusted again, this time deliberately. I stopped anticipating future roles and focused on immediate tasks, stopped reading subtext into silence, accepted outcomes as settled. That adaptation worked. Things became smoother, predictable, efficient, and that was the danger, because with that smoothness came a deeper cost. I no longer recognized the version of myself these systems were responding to. It wasn't diminished competence, it was diminished authority. And because everything still functioned, there was no signal that anything needed review. What unsettled me most was how easy it would be to stay here indefinitely, useful, informed, diminished, without anything forcing a reckoning. The erosion didn't demand resistance, it rewarded compliance. And standing inside that quiet efficiency, I understood that the final cost wouldn't arrive as removal or denial. It would arrive later, when credibility was required, when judgment mattered, and the absence would be treated not as a loss, but as evidence that my voice had never been essential in the first place. My contribution would be evaluated only for how well it fit a direction I no longer influence. The unsettling part wasn't exclusion, it was how little resistance my absence generated. The system worked, people adapted, the day continued, and in that continuity, something settled permanently. Not that I had been removed, but that my relevance had been quietly solved for. I was still visible, still competent, still present enough to justify my inclusion, just no longer positioned where judgment formed. No confrontation ever came. No correction. No moment where I could point and say there. That's where it changed. It had already changed by the time I understood the shape of it. What remained was a life that functioned at a reduced resolution, productive, cooperative, intact, but missing the dimension where choice once mattered. I adjusted because adjustment was reasonable. I stayed because staying was logical. And eventually, I stopped checking whether anything could be recovered because nothing had been explicitly taken. The loss was not dramatic enough to grieve. It was simply consistent enough to live with. That's what made it permanent. If you followed this story to its end, you already know this isn't really about me. It's about recognizing the moment when compliance replaces influence, when access fades without denial, when a person becomes reliable precisely because they are no longer disruptive to the outcome. Some of you will recognize this shape immediately. Others may feel it approaching without having named it yet. If this story reflected something familiar or unsettled, something you hadn't fully articulated, I'd like to know. And if you want to explore what happens after normalization or trace how early signals turn into irreversible patterns, tell me which direction this should go next.